Now, to conclude this module, we'll have our second lecture, which you should not skip. The first one was the refs lecture. Now we're going to talk about the Vue instance lifecycle, which is also important. We learned how Vue works under the hood, we learned about the virtual DOM, and that there are various steps for bringing something onto the screen. Sometimes you need to run code during those steps. And that's why Vue has a quite elaborate lifecycle where you can step in at any time to execute code you need to execute. And you will see some of those lifecycle hooks we're going to discuss now in action throughout this course, by the way. It all starts with us creating a new app and, of course, mounting it with the mount method to the HTML code, to the DOM, so that Vue knows where to render the app. Then, when it starts creating the app and starts bringing something onto the screen, it reaches a couple of points, a couple of lifecycle phases, which are also reflected in methods you can add to your Vue app configuration object to run code you might need to run at this point of time. For example, the first lifecycle phase, the first so-called lifecycle hook that is reached, is the before create phase. It's followed by a created phase. The difference is that before create is basically called before the app has been fully initialized, whereas created is called thereafter. At this point of time, we still have nothing on the screen though. After created, Vue just knows its data properties and it's aware of the general app configuration. But now is the time where the template is compiled. So where all the dynamic placeholders, all the interpolations and so on are removed and replaced with the concrete values that should be shown to the user. Thereafter, the before mount hook is reached. Before mount means that this is right before Vue is actually going to bring something to the screen. So right before we can see something on the screen. So now after created and before mount, we reach mounted. So that in the end just means that now we see something on the screen. Now the Vue app was initialized, the template was compiled, Vue knows what to show on the screen, and it handed those instructions off to the browser so that the browser really adds all the HTML elements with all the content we need as defined by our Vue app. So now we have our mounted Vue app, our mounted Vue instance. Now, of course, in most Vue apps, data changes at some point of time, and that then triggers a new lifecycle. Now we reach the before update hook and thereafter the updated hook. This is a bit like before create and created. Before update is reached before the update has been fully processed internally by Vue in its app. Updated is reached once that has been processed. This, by the way, also means that at this point of time, the update is visible on the screen. So we don't reach mounted again because the template was never unmounted. So it always was visible. After updated, the changes just have been processed and have been rendered to the screen, whereas in before update, they haven't. Now, sometimes an instance can also be unmounted. A Vue app can be unmounted. We haven't had this scenario yet. It will become more important later, as you will see, but I can also show you how we could unmount an app in the next lecture. When an app is unmounted, all its content is removed from the screen and the app is dead. And we have two lifecycle hooks here as well. Before unmount, which runs right before it's about to be removed, and unmounted, which runs after it has been removed. You can, for example, use these hooks to execute any cleanup code you might want to do, send a HTTP request to your server to keep track of that app being unmounted, or whatever you need to do. Now let's see all those hooks in action to make it a bit clearer how they work. To see it in action, I'm back in app.js and I'll go back to my main Vue app, which is the one with this input field. Now I mentioned all those lifecycle hooks, and I mentioned that these would be methods you can add to your Vue app. And with that, I don't mean methods you add in your methods option, because in there you really only add the methods you plan on calling yourself or which you want to call upon events like clicks. Instead, you add them right next to data and methods, anywhere you want in this app. So for example here, towards the end of this app configuration object. Here, we could add the before create method, which I showed on the slide. You just add it as a method like this, and here we can console log before create so that we get an idea for when this runs. And of course, you could do more than just logging here. You could send an HTTP request to a server. You could set a timer. You could do whatever you need to do. If I now expand this again, open the console and reload, you see before create being logged here. And actually, I'll comment out this log message here at the very bottom so that we're not confused by that. So let's go back to our Vue app again then, reload, and we see before create. If we do something else and go to the Sources tab here in the Chrome Developer Tools, we actually can also inspect our source code there. And I'm showing this to you here because there's something neat we can do with that. We can actually find the before create method here in the app.js file and click here to set a breakpoint. As a consequence, code execution will pause when this is reached. And if you now reload the page, you will see it pauses here, and you can always continue by clicking the blue play button. But the interesting thing, and the reason for why I'm doing this, is that you see there's nothing on the screen yet. As I mentioned, in before create, you won't see anything on the screen. At this point, actually, not even the Vue app will have been fully initialized. So let me click the blue button here to continue and remove the breakpoint by clicking on it again. Let's now add the second hook, which is the created hook. At this point of time, the Vue app was initialized internally, but it was not mounted yet. So visually, we'll still not see anything. If I reload in the console, we see created. And if we go back to sources and I add a breakpoint in the created hook now, if I reload, you see again at this point there's nothing on the screen, just as I explained. So let me remove the breakpoint and continue, and let's add more lifecycle hooks. The next hook in place is before mount. This triggers right before this app really is mounted. So right before we see something on the screen. So we'll still not see anything here, but we will see something in the next hook thereafter, which is mounted. So here, let me console log mounted. And let's then save this, go back to the JavaScript console and reload. And we see before create, created, before mount, and mounted. But again, it's more interesting if we go to sources and now add a breakpoint in before mount and in mounted. And now reload. And we first pause in before mount because that hook runs first. And you see nothing on the screen. If you now click resume, so this blue play button here, we pause on the next breakpoint, which is in mounted, and now you see something on the screen. As I explained, because at this point of time, this Vue app was mounted to the screen. It was initialized internally, all the data was processed, the template was compiled, and it's showing its output on the screen. So with that, we can also remove those breakpoints and resume again. Now with that, the creation lifecycle here is finished, but I mentioned that we would have data changes which also trigger their own lifecycle hooks. So let's see those in action as well. After mounted here, though as mentioned before, the exact position does not matter, but after mounted I'll add before update. and console log before update here. And I will also add updated. The difference will be that in before update, we'll not see the changes on the screen yet. In updated, we will. So if we go to the JavaScript console in the DevTools and reload, we don't see those hooks being executed because nothing was updated in this app. It was created, but nothing was updated. So now let's enter a new text here. And if I click set text now, you see before update and updated. And if we go to the source tab again and add some breakpoints in before update and an updated, we can also see that if I change this again, for example, to add more exclamation marks, we now pause and we first pause in before update. And you notice that the text output here on the screen is still the old one. Because as mentioned, in before update, the update was not fully processed yet, it's not visible on the screen. If I resume, we pause and update it, and indeed at this point of time, the output has been processed and is visible on the screen. So again, I'm removing those breakpoints and resuming, and that hopefully shows the updating process. Now, as mentioned before, we also can unmount a Vue app even though we haven't done this thus far. We then trigger the before unmount and the unmounted hooks. And as also mentioned before, this unmounting process will become more relevant later. Nonetheless, let's see it in action now already. And for that, back in code here, I'm going to add the before unmount hook and console log before unmount. And I'm also going to add the unmounted hook and hence console log unmounted here, so that both those hooks are implemented and we log a message for them. But at the moment, this app will never get unmounted. We have no way of killing or removing it. But just as we have an app mount method, we also have an app unmount method to remove a Vue app. Now, you will rarely call this method in a real application though. Instead, you will later see a way more realistic scenario of unmounting apps. But at the moment, we're missing a key prerequisite for that, so we're going to work with that unmount method instead. We could set a timer here and set it to 3 seconds, let's say, and then have a function in which we call unmount, so that 3 seconds after the app was created and mounted, we destroy it, we unmount it. And if we now save that and reload, you will see that after 3 seconds, the app is gone on the screen and we see before unmount and unmounted. And of course, again, we could also go to the sources and simply add breakpoints here in before unmount and in unmounted, and reload and see how this pauses after 3 seconds. First in before unmount, at which point of time we still see the app, so that's the last chance to work with it. But then, if I resume, it's removed in unmounted. And that is the Vue lifecycle with all its hooks. In reality, you will only need a few of those hooks. Nonetheless, of course, I wanted to show them to you because this is the complete guide after all, and not the I show you some things guide. Nonetheless, we'll especially see hooks like created, mounted, or unmounted in action throughout this course, as well as updated. And with that, we can also leave this module. We now have a solid understanding of the basic features, and not just of how to use them, but also how they work under the hood. And with that, you already made a huge step in the right direction to becoming a Vue developer. In the last module, we had a look under the hood of Vue. Maybe you skipped this module, that's fine as well. But if you skipped it, be aware that in that module, I also talked about using multiple Vue apps, and I highlighted that those apps would then not be connected, so that every Vue app you have, which controls its part of the HTML page, is totally independent from other apps. Now we're going to take this concept of multiple apps one step further, and we're going to explore Vue components, another core feature built into Vue, which indeed builds up on all the other pieces you learned about thus far. So this is an important next step, because as you will see, components will now be there throughout the entire rest of the course, and components are a super important concept in Vue, but also in other alternative frameworks like Angular or React, just in case you ever want to explore those as well. In this module, we will therefore see what exactly components are and why we have this concept and how we use it, of course. And we'll start working with some components so that we get a first idea of what a component is and what we can do with it. Now again, attached you find a starting project, which gives you this page essentially. It's a little dummy application where you can keep a list of your friends around and store the phone number and email address of your friends. It's just a dummy application, but it will allow us to explore the concept of components. Now, if we inspect the code for this, we got an index.html file with some markup, to be precise with an unordered list that holds the two friend list items, so one list item per friend, and then we have a nested list in every friend with the phone and email number. We got the name, we got a button which currently does nothing, and important, we also got an empty app.js file, so no Vue app at all. And now it would not be totally unrealistic that this should be managed as one app, and we maybe don't want to hard code this friend data into the HTML code, but instead we want to keep that friend data around in our Vue code, in our Vue application. And we don't want to hard code those list items into the HTML code, but we want to render those list items dynamically with Vue.js. And it turns out that with the knowledge we gained thus far, that is possible, but actually has some tricky elements to it. But let's try implementing this with what we learned thus far. So in the app.js file, I'm going to create a new Vue app with Vue create app. And of course, we're going to mount this to control a part of the DOM with it. And here I want to control this section, which has an ID of app. So let's target this with this ID selector here. And now let's say we want to implement this by adding some data here. And actually in here, we have our friends property, which should be an array full of data about our friends. And each friend could be represented by an object where we, for example, have an ID, Manuel, for example, then a name field, Manuel Lawrence for my friend Manuel here, a phone field with that imaginary phone number. You can try calling it, maybe you get someone there, but I just made that number up. And the email address, which of course also is fictionary. So let's store that as well. And with that, we would have an entry for Manuel. Now let's add a second one for Julie. So here we have Julie Jones. We can grab her imaginary phone number and store that here, and also grab her imaginary email address and store that here. And now we have that data managed in JavaScript. And as before in the course, that is a scenario you will typically have. That could be data which you fetched from a database. It could be data which the user entered. You will rarely have websites where you hard code data like this into the HTML code. That's why this approach, which we had here initially, is not very realistic, and why we instead might want to use Vue. Also, to, for example, make this button work and ensure that we only show our details here with the phone number and the email if the button is pressed. So therefore, now we have that data. With that data, we can delete one of the two list items and then use v4 here, as we learned it, to go through all the friends in this friends data property. So in this data property which holds this array. So we're looping through these two array elements now. And therefore now inside of this list item, inside of v4, we can now interpolate friend.name, for example. Here, for the phone number, we can output, with double curly braces, friend.phone. And instead of the email address, we can output friend.email. And we can also assign a key here and bind it dynamically to friend.id, because we have that ID field on every friend entry. And with that, if we save all that and reload, we get the same as before, but now with less HTML code leveraging Vue. But the Show Details button is not working, and that's the part where it gets tricky. Of course, we could add methods here, and then add a method which we could call toggle details, which should be connected to the button, and we want to show the details if they're not currently visible and hide them if they were visible. So we could add a second data property, details are visible, which initially, let's say, is false, to initially not show them. And then here in toggle details, we set details are visible to what they're currently not, to basically invert the value, as we also did it many times before. And with that, we can go back to the HTML code and connect that button. Upon a click, I want to trigger toggle details. So I want to execute this newly added method here. And then we got that details are visible property, which we can use with vIf on this unordered list to control whether that list should be shown, so whether it should be added to the DOM or not. We can then even replace this label on the button dynamically by checking if details are visible, and if they are, the button should say hide details and only otherwise say show details. And of course, we could also use a computed property here, but I want to keep this simple and to the point, so I will not do it here. If we now reload, we get the button. But the problem is, no matter on which friend we press the button, we always show the details, or hide the details, of all friends. And it should be obvious why that happens. With v4, we output multiple list items here, one for every friend. But the button always points at the same method. So every button for every friend gets the same event handler. It points at the same method. So no matter which button on which friend we press, we always call the same method, and we just have details are visible here, which is just one property that controls the visibility of the details in both contexts. Now, there would be workarounds. We could pass the ID here to toggle details. We could forward the friend ID to toggle details. And then inside of toggle details, we could expect that ID and now manage two properties. Details are visible A, details are visible B, and we could try to make it work with properties like that. But still, it would be very cumbersome. I'm not sure how we would make it work with vIf to find out on which friend we are here. So ultimately, this is not what we want to do. I also don't even want to get started with having A, B, C, and whatever here, because this list may grow dynamically. It doesn't in this application because it's a simple one, but if you allow users to add new friends, you can't anticipate how many properties you'll need to toggle the visibility of the details. So this will lead nowhere, and therefore I'll revert this here. This is not how I want to solve that. Instead, that's exactly the kind of problem we can solve with components. So let's see what components are, how we create them, and how we work with them. Components are great if you have certain pieces of HTML, certain HTML blocks, like here, which you reuse in different parts of your page, like here, where we create multiple list items, where you then have a certain functionality that should be enclosed in that HTML block, and that should be specific to this HTML block. Components can also be great to splitting your big application into multiple smaller chunks, but that's something we'll explore later automatically once we work more and more with components. So, since components seem to be very helpful, how can we create such a component? How does it work? A component is an official feature Vue.js knows. And we can create one on an app. So on an app we created with create app, by using that app, which in my case here is stored in that app constant, and calling the component method on it. This tells Vue that we want to create a new component. Now this component method needs two things. The first thing is an identifier, because a component, and that's important, you have to memorize this, a component is basically like a custom HTML element. So here you define your own HTML tag. And that could, for example, be user-contact or friend-contact, something like this. You should always use an identifier that contains a dash. So you should always have component names, custom HTML tags therefore, which contain a dash, so which are made up of two words. The reason for that is simple. This avoids that you potentially clash with official built-in HTML elements. For example, if I would name my component h2, well, there already is a h2 element, and that would therefore clash. Therefore, a simple rule is that you should use multi-word component names, so custom HTML tags, because all built-in HTML elements are single-word elements. So that's now my own HTML element name, which we will later be able to use. This is the identifier of our component, so to say. The second argument you pass to this component method is a config object, just as you pass it to create app. Because, and that's another important piece of information to keep in mind, a Vue component is essentially just another Vue app, just an app that belongs to another app. So this component, which we're creating here, is a new Vue app, but, and that's the important thing, an app which will be connected to our main app. So components are like mini apps, you could say. So therefore they can also have data, they can have methods, and therefore here our component can have its own data, where we, for example, have a details are visible property, which initially is false. We can also add methods to our component and add our toggle details method here to the methods of my own component, so that we then toggle this component specific data with this component specific method. And we can remove methods from the main app now and also get rid of details are visible there. We could also keep it here. We wouldn't have a clash because this component is essentially encapsulated. It does not communicate with the parent app, so with the app it belongs to, but we can still remove this property because we don't need it in the main app anymore. So now we got our component, friend contact. And how do we now use this component and how does it work? Well, this component misses one important thing before we can use it, and that's a template. Since this is a new app, it needs its own template. Our main app has a template, this whole section, which we mounted the app to, but our component now is a mini app and needs its own template. Now here we don't mount this component, we don't call mount on it, so that's not how we will connect it to HTML. Instead here, for the moment, we'll add this template option, which I also showed in the deep dive, in the behind the scenes module. In case you skipped that, yes, there is a template option which you can add to your View Apps, also to the main app, to define the template of that app. So to define the HTML code of that app. And you need to do that for this component. Now, I will already say that later in the course, in the next modules, we will learn about a much nicer way of defining those templates. But for the moment, I'll just create a multi-line string here with backticks. So these are not single quotes, these are backticks, which is a different character on the keyboard. And I will now grab this list item here, so this entire code, and cut it from my HTML file and instead add it here in this backticked string. And I'm using backticks because they allow me to write a multi-line string like this. But in the end, that's just a JavaScript string now, with all those view features in it though. Now I will remove that v-for code on the list item, and to make sure the interpolations work, for the moment, I will add a friend property to the data of that component. So not friends, but friend. And I will just copy one friend which I defined here. Let's take Manuel and store him in this friend key. This is just temporary. We'll soon make it work with our list again, but to get started, we'll just use friend like that. And now if I save that, we can finally start using our own component and therefore our own HTML element. Because now we can go to index.html, and inside of our main apps template, we can now use friend contact as if it would be an official HTML element. And it's not. I really want to emphasize it. This is not an HTML element which the browser would know. If you try to use that outside of the view app controlled part, this will do nothing. The browser will ignore it. But inside of our main app, Vue will understand this. It will understand this component because we registered this component to our main app with the component method by giving it that exact identifier, which I'm now using as a HTML tag in my template. And that's why we should use a non-default HTML tag name here, because if we would have named our component h2, Vue would not recognize it as a custom component, of course. But since we have such a name with a dash in it, a two-word name, which is this identifier we used here, Vue detects that here, in the end, we want to render this mini app with its template and all the dynamic pieces in the template. So now if we save this again and reload, we see Manuel Lawrence on the screen. And we can click show details and hide details, and this just works. And now we can repeat that and simply add another component. And if I reload, we have Manuel Lawrence twice. And the important thing is, every Manuel Lawrence works standalone, totally detached from the other one. Now, of course, we have the same data twice now. That's something we're going to fix soon. But this shows you how components allow you to easily replicate an encapsulated piece of HTML code with, and that's the important part, with attached data and logic. So components are reusable pieces of HTML with connected data and logic. And that is very, very powerful, especially as you will soon see how we can also reuse one and the same component with different data that we pass into the component. That will be the next step, which will then really make components a powerful tool. But you can hopefully already see how a component helps us encapsulate structure, content, and logic into small, reusable pieces. And you can really add as many of these components here as you want, and they will all be rendered and they all work standalone. So now we got a bunch of Vue mini apps in the same main app. And these apps will then also be able to communicate with each other, to share information, and hence will have the best of both worlds. Encapsulated, isolated pieces of code, which also makes it easier to work on that code in case you have bigger projects, And at the same time, we can combine all those isolated pieces to build a bigger app from them. Now that are components, and they will be super important, and we're going to use them throughout the rest of the course. But at the same time, we're now already reaching a part where this setup we used thus far has certain limitations. We'll have more and more code in the same file, and writing templates like this in such a string form, that will not be very nice to do. In addition, we of course also need to learn more about components so that we can really make this component reusable and also work with different data, so that the component acts like a shell to which we can pass different data. We'll take care of all of that in the next modules. Now in this module, we're just getting started with components, and we don't really see their full potential yet. This will change. Over the next modules, you will learn all about components, and you will learn how you can build applications like this one, where the entire user interface is built by combining components, and where we use components to encapsulate different templates and logic tied to that templates into reusable building blocks. You will see how that makes it easier to structure the codebase of complex apps and keep it manageable by splitting your code, your logic, and also your templates and what's on the screen into smaller reusable pieces. Now this is all code you won't understand at this point, but we'll get there, and we'll get there starting in the next module. Now before we dig deeper into components and we learn more about this amazing and very important feature, we need to change how we write our code. I mean, not the language or anything like that, but our setup. Because it turns out that this setup, which we're currently using, of having one JavaScript file which we import here into one HTML file, which we simply opened by double-clicking on it, and where we have to reload the page whenever we want to see a change, that setup will not really scale well. We'll have problems with that setup if we start building bigger, more realistic applications. And therefore, in this module, we're going to dive into a better development setup with the Vue CLI. So with an extra tool we can use to basically give us a better project setup, which in the end will help us write Vue apps, build Vue apps at scale. So build bigger Vue apps and simply have a better time building Vue apps. Now, for that in this module, you will of course learn what exactly the Vue CLI is, and even more important than that, why we need that extra tool, why specifically we need that better setup, and of course I'll show you how to use that Vue CLI tool and how to create better project setups and then work with them. Before we start using the Vue CLI, before we start creating those better project setups, which I talked about, let's understand why exactly we might need such better setups. Now here's one thing which we will, for example, need: a proper development web server. Now what do I mean by that? Currently, we're testing our Vue application by double-clicking the index.html file and then seeing it in the browser. This works, but it's actually unrealistic. It's actually not how we want to test this. Why? Because with that, we actually use the file protocol instead of the HTTPS protocol. You can see this here. This is loaded as a file in the browser. Now, if I load a page like google.com, this is not loaded as a file. Instead here, this is loaded as a website using the HTTP or actually the HTTPS protocol. And that is a totally different thing that influences how the page is served and also which features are available in our code. So which features we can use in our JavaScript code. And with that file protocol, thus far everything worked, but that wouldn't stay that way. because indeed certain modern JavaScript features would not really work in that file protocol setup. And in addition, there is one important thing you have to keep in mind. The users of your website, of your Vue web app, so the users you want to target with your app, they will in the end visit a website, right? You're building a website which eventually will be hosted on some server. So therefore, the final app which your users see will be hosted by a server and therefore will be served via HTTPS, not via that file protocol. That file protocol is only available locally on your computer if you double-click the HTML file. That's not what will be used once the web page is served to your users by a server in the end. And therefore, you're doing something which is not really good. You're testing your web application under different circumstances than your users will see them in the end. Now, I can tell you, thus far, that wouldn't make a difference. What you learned over the last modules applies in exactly the same way, no matter how the HTML file is served. But going forward, we definitely want to switch to a more realistic development setup, and we, for example, definitely want to have a development web server, which is a web server running locally on your machine, so that you don't need to pay for any server right now. You can still test everything locally on your machine, but with an important difference. This development web server, which I will show you how to set up, it will be very easy, no worries. This development web server will serve your web app, your HTML file, via the HTTPS or the HTTP protocol on your machine, not via the file protocol. And that will be one important difference. Now, besides the need for a web development server, there also are other reasons for switching to a better development setup. Because you might not have noticed it yet, but actually you might want a better developer experience. Thus far, the way we wrote code, it worked, but it has certain flaws. Our current way of writing and testing the Vue app has flaws. So let's see what our current state is. At the moment, we always need to reload the page whenever we make any change to our code. So for example, here, if I go to my JavaScript file and let's say I do change some data here, change the name to Manuel Lorenzo, and I want to see this on the page, after saving the JavaScript file, I need to reload the page. Now, this might not sound like a bad thing. I mean, it's really easy and quick to do, but if you're working on an application, on a web application, for hours and days, and you're writing a lot of code and you want to test a lot of things, always having to reload can be very annoying. It's also worth noting that when you reload, of course, you lose all the state of your application. If this was expanded and you reload, you're back to the initial loading state again. And those tiny things can add up and actually cost you a lot of valuable time and make development unnecessarily harder or simply take longer. And that's not something you might want. In addition, at the moment in our IDE, in our code editor, Visual Studio Code, the support we get by that tool is highly limited. For example, the auto-completion is highly limited. If I, for example, want to call Vue create app, Visual Studio Code doesn't even understand that there is a Vue object available. If I type a dot, it doesn't know which methods I can call on this. It suggests create app here because I used it before in that file, but if I didn't, it wouldn't know that it exists. So that's also something which is annoying. It would be nicer to get better IDE support, to get more IDE auto-completion, and for example, to also get warnings and errors if we add a typo. At the moment, if I call create app like this, because I forgot the E, yes, the app won't work, and we'll get an error here in the browser, in the JavaScript console, but we don't get any warning in the editor. And it would be nice to get a better support here so that we don't even try to run code which has a simple typo like this. Now, last but not least, thus far I always worked with just one HTML and one JavaScript file. And we could add more files and combine them, but we would have to manage all those imports with script source tags, for example, manually. And for multiple HTML files, it wouldn't even be that easy, because whilst we could have multiple files, if we switch between those files, we would always in the end load a new page and therefore lose all the state that might have been saved in JavaScript. So any intermediate results of calculations and so on. So currently we're kind of limited regarding how we can split our code, how we can make our code more readable. And of course, at the moment, having just one JavaScript file works. We don't have that much code. But it's easy to imagine that as we build more and more complex applications, we have more and more code, and we might want to split that code across multiple files to make every file itself a bit more readable. And for example, things like this template here, which we have for this component. Having it in a string like this is a bit annoying, but at the moment it's all we can do. We have no better way of defining this template. We can't do it in the HTML file because for components, we can't mount them to HTML as we do with Vue apps. So that's another thing that would be great if we could get rid of it. And therefore, our current state clearly has some room for improvement. Our wanted state might look like this. It would be great if saved changes, so whenever we change something in code and we save those changes, would be auto-detected, and then the page would automatically reload, or maybe even better than that, not just reload, but simply update that part of the page that did change and therefore keep all our state around. That would be great. It would save us a lot of time. The IDE, so the code editor we're using, should provide better autocompletion and hints to make sure that we're able to find errors quicker and avoid writing code that doesn't work. And it would be great if we would have an easy time splitting our code across multiple files, defining the templates of components in a nicer way, and using modern JavaScript features like ES modules for exporting and importing JavaScript code into each other for that. That would be nice, and that's our wanted state. And that's exactly where the Vue CLI is able to help us. So let's find out what exactly the Vue CLI is, how it helps us, and how we use it. Now, the Vue CLI is not a mandatory tool. Let me really make that clear. It's not the same as the Vue framework, which we've been using thus far. It's just an additional tool also managed by the team behind Vue. It simply helps us create projects with a certain configuration and with certain built-in tools that give us all those nice features I was talking about in the last lectures. So it helps us create projects and manage projects that allow us to build more realistic, bigger applications. So how do we use the Vue CLI? Well, the Vue CLI under the hood uses certain tools which you will need. The most important tool which you will need is Node.js. Node.js is a JavaScript runtime which in the end allows you to run JavaScript code outside of the browser as well. You could use Node.js to write server-side code with JavaScript, but that's not what we're going to do in this course. This is not a Node.js course. So you will not learn Node.js here, and you will also not need to write any Node.js code. No worries. But we need Node.js installed on our machine because the Vue CLI uses it under the hood. So make sure you visit nodejs.org and simply download the latest version there. This gives you an installer which you can download, and you can simply walk through that installer and confirm all the defaults. It's available for all operating systems, and it's really a straightforward installation process. You don't need any special settings or setup or anything like that. Simply walk through that installer and install Node.js on your system, no matter if you're using Windows or macOS or Linux. Now, once this finished, you got Node.js installed, which the Vue CLI needs, but you also got this npm tool installed here. That's another tool that comes together with Node.js, NPM stands for Node Package Manager, and that's a tool which we're also going to use, for example, to install the Vue CLI on our system, but also later to install extra packages into our project which we might need. I'll come back to that when we need it. So let's finish that installation and let's now see how we install the Vue CLI. For that, we can go to installation in the official docs, but it's really straightforward. You need Node installed, as I mentioned, and then once you did install Node, you can run this command here in the terminal or command prompt of your system. So open up your system terminal or command prompt. Every operating system comes with one. So here I'm in the macOS terminal. On Windows, you would use the Windows command prompt. And in there, run npm install -g @vue/CLI. Like this. On Mac and Linux, you might need to add sudo in front of this to get the right permissions. On Windows, this is not required and actually also will not work. So on Windows, it's just npm install -g @vue/CLI. Now, once you entered this command, hit enter, maybe enter your password if you're prompted for it. And now this will go ahead and install this Vue CLI tool globally on your system, so that we can thereafter use it to generate Vue projects with it. So let's wait for this installation to finish. Now, once it finished successfully, which you can tell by the fact that you see a message like this towards the end of this output, once it finished, you can find a place on your system where you want to create a new project. And with find a place, I mean here in the terminal. You can navigate around with the cd command. In case you're not sure about that, make sure you pick up some terminal or command prompt basics. Now, once you found that place on your system, so the path on your system where you want to create a new project, for me it's in the Udemy folder somewhere on my system, you can run Vue create to create a new project folder and a new Vue app therefore in that place, and then pick any name of your choice. I'm going to name this Vue first app with dashes between the words, but the name is up to you. It should be a name without any white space though. So it should be one word in the end, where you can separate words with dashes if you want to. Hit enter thereafter, and you will be prompted a couple of questions. Now, the exact look of this menu might change, but here I'm currently asked whether I want to use the default settings for Vue 2, the default settings for Vue 3. Now, most likely Vue 3 will be the first choice in the future. I'm recording this at a point of time where Vue 3 is not fully final yet, is not really released yet. Hence, for me, it's just the second option here. Or you can manually select features you want to have in your new project. Now I'm going to go with that. And now here you got various features which you can configure into your project. Now, if you don't know what all these things are, you can really just go with the default. Otherwise, you can add them as needed. There are a couple of features in here, like router and Vuex, which we'll learn about throughout this course. So for the moment, we can really go with the defaults here and simply hit enter to confirm them. Choose the Vue version if you are prompted for it. I'll go with 3.x, which this course is about, the latest version of Vue, and you should choose that as well if you're prompted. And here, with the ESLint settings, I'll go with that ESLint with error prevention only strategy. Confirm the default here as well if you're asked for it, and you can go with the first option here in this last question as well. Again, the exact options might differ, but the process should always be close to what you're seeing here. Now, we could save our picked settings here as a default or as a preset for future projects, but I'm going to pick no here and not save it as a preset. And now this will create a new folder with the name we chose initially, with a Vue project inside of it, but now with a Vue project that has certain extra features to make our life as a Vue developer easier. No worries though, you'll still write Vue code as you learned it over the last modules. It'll just be a nicer experience. So let's wait for the Vue project generation to finish. And once this does finish, you see two commands here which you can execute in order to see your generated Vue app in action, because you get a little dummy app in that newly created folder. So we can first of all cd, so navigate into this newly created folder, and then run npm run serve, which executes a predefined script to basically spin up such a testing web development server I was talking about, which will then host this default dummy app we got here. And you can view that app in your browser under this address now, which now uses the HTTP instead of the file protocol, which, as mentioned in an earlier lecture, is exactly what we want. So let's copy that address and enter this in the browser, and you should see something like this. Now, the exact screen you're seeing here might change over time. This doesn't matter too much because we're going to write our own app anyways, but you should see something on the screen, which proves that your development server is up and running and that some Vue project was generated. Now let's explore what was generated, which features we have available here, and which extra settings and tweaks we might need to do.